we have a very special guest among us, Mr. Siddharth Rao, who is an eminent personality and he has worked tirelessly since over 18 years in the field of conservation and supporting local communities and incorporating newer technology and making conservation much more sustainable. So he has many famous and successful projects in his credentials, but one of them which I think is really commendable is the Kalpivali Community Area Conservation Project. So I wholeheartedly welcome you, sir, and I hope we have a wonderful session ahead. Starting off, I would we would really love to know a little bit more about your background and your work, and in what field you have worked, and like what future prospects do you wish to continue with. Over to you, sir.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks, Ikra. That was a little too flattering an introduction. I'm part of larger groups, and I work with a lot of other people, and I'm a small part in this. And I think I have been working with conservation and with wildlife conservation, nature conservation, and with rural development for a while now. So I started off pretty young, at 18, 19, getting interested in these issues and apprenticing and working either with wildlife conservation research, things like that, or with issues of rural development. And along the way, I have been lucky to have been part of many interesting projects, and some of which I've led now in the recent past. I currently run two small organizations. The Kalpivali project you were talking about was part of a larger organization called the Timbuktu Collective. Until now, I just recently stepped back from full-time work with the collective, where I was directing the ecology program. And that is a phenomenal project, actually. It's 30 years of work. It's not my work only. I was a part of that, and it's an example of great community-led effort to restore nature and to be sustainable, as you say. Right now, I work with the organization called the Adavi Trust, and I've just started a small restoration company called ILA, which is working on restoring landscapes and land. So that's what I do, and I think I'll continue to be involved with anything that has to do with nature conservation, restoration, and working with rural communities and getting people to be involved in conserving nature in whatever form.
The World Wildlife Federation in 2020 released a report on the Living Planet Index, and it showed that about 68% of animal species have reduced in quantities, and many are endangered, and it is going at a much catastrophic speed ever since the time period of 1970 up to like 2016. So, sir, in your knowledge and with the experience you've had in conserving wildlife species, how do you think, like, what led us to this extent, and how should we, as individuals, look into it?
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, right now this report has come out, or it's getting some attention, and but this is not something new. And we are entering what is now being called the Anthropocene, where human beings have changed the planet so much and have changed our interaction with wild beings, with spaces, to such an extent that we have lost species. And so there's a couple of things that we have to keep in mind. One is people have always interacted with the environment. So this concept of wilderness, where there is wild spaces and there are no humans, is actually not true. At every juncture, as far as humans have been around pretty much throughout human history, humans have been interacting with their natural environment, and almost every single part of the planet has some form of human interaction. There have been species extinctions. People have led the downfall of many megafauna, for example, across. But what is different since the Industrial Revolution has been the rate and scale at which this has happened. So yes, there have been communities which have overfished, overhunted, or overexploited, but the impact on the scale of that was usually relatively low, or wasn't worldwide. So now with our new globalized way of living and our consumptive patterns, what has really happened is that it has completely become a widespread phenomena. And so, I mean, the statistics are really quite crazy and shocking. You see things like we're losing 200 species a day when you look at plants, fungi, animals, things like that. So you're seeing really a reduction in, so this report that you're talking about, you're seeing a reduction. So they've looked at, basically they've studied, say, 20,000 populations of animals across time. So they've looked at 40 years of data. They've been studying trends. And they're seeing the population numbers coming down. So you're seeing a decline. And if you look at South America, for example, you're having 97% decrease, and you have things like amphibians and reptiles which are getting knocked out, the frogs getting wiped out due to disease like the chytrid fungus. So there are a couple of factors of why we've gotten here. One major factor is habitat loss, or one of the ways in which we've gotten here. The second is looking at invasive species have taken over and they're completely destroying stuff, over harvesting of resources. Now the question is, why have we done this? And that boils down to our worldview, I think. So it's not so simple to say, it's not that the blame or the impacts are evenly distributed. So you have a particular way of looking at the world, which is exploitative, which is extractive, which is looking at nature as separate. And when we do that, then we end up consuming, and we look at nature in a very, not in a way in which we respect it, or not in a way in which we feel we're part of it, or that it needs to be taken care of, or we are not even taken care of. That's a bit condescending, but to respect what we are part of. So we have ended up in a cultural system of where we are looking at it as resources just to be taken. And that, I think, is the fundamental reason why we've gotten here. And we have completely taken everyone down with us. And so at the crux of it, this is not so much an economic issue. It's not so much a political issue. It's a cultural, it's a very personal, it's a social issue. And that is where, that is I feel the answer, and that is the issue, is that we're looking at it, for example, a lot of the times as a macroeconomic issue, and how do we solve it and all this stuff. But it's a social thing. We need to recognize that we very much, nature and the world, the natural world, is intrinsic to our basic well-being and survival. And we have to take care of it. I mean, the ecosystem services, as it were, that nature is providing, it's invaluable. There's no monetary value we can put on it, but which is what people are doing now. So it is that worldview that has taken us, this overconsumptive, the model of economics that we're following, that has brought us into such a bad situation.
As you mentioned that, of course, resource depletion, or species decline has been happening since time immemorial, but it was more so prevalent since the onset of industrialization and globalization, and different countries or different regions are developing at their own pace. So although it is not a macroeconomic issue, however, when we talk of solutions, at maybe geopolitical level, so we know, according to statistics, that developed nations have about 5 GHA per person of ecological footprint of consumption, so which is very high. And but developing nations, on the other hand, have still about 1.6 GHA per person, which when we see when we see the condition in India, how rapidly species are declining, and they are falling under the blanket of threat more and more. So this number really does not sort of give justice to it. We are we are developing in a way that is not going hand in hand with our environment. So what do you think should be a sort of a lesson that we should learn, and we should keep in mind, since we are a developing nation, and what things we should keep in mind to carry out a sustainable and sort of environmental friendly way of development, if you will?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, it boils down again, no, to this thing of who's responsible, who has led us here, what has led us here, kind of thing. And it can get quite messy when we look at it at a larger scale, or at a nation scale, at the scale of nations. But what's interesting, so there's one thing which is, now we're narrowing everything down to carbon. We're narrowing everything down to greenhouse gases, and that's being used as an indicator of other things. So that's not really a good indicator of species loss, for example. So one is the way in which we're actually even monitoring this is flawed. To look at just carbon and look at just your impact, your greenhouse, your carbon footprint is a flawed way to even start looking at the problem, because that lets you circumvent a whole bunch of stuff. So that in itself has got a lot of issues. Having said that, of course, it's important in terms of how much emission you're putting out there is an important factor, and how you reduce that is an important factor. And different people or different communities are responsible at different scales and different levels for this. And you have a bunch of nations or groups who are sitting pretty after having completely trashed their own environment, their own systems, or even exported that trashing of the environment to other nations, and are now sitting on resources, but are now dictating that, okay, developing countries have to follow these norms and have to, develop in a certain way. It is a very controversial topic, and it needs to be addressed, because there is logic to that everybody should have some form of a sustainable or regenerative approach to developing. At the same time, in my opinion, I think the onus of taking that step has to be on those who already have benefited from these exploitative measures. So if you're going to preach from there saying that, okay, you can't do this, you shouldn't do that, fair enough. Yes, I'm in agreement with that, saying that yes, we need to find ways of developing well and sustainably and with nature. How do we do that? And who's going to take that initiative? So you can't actually have the poorest of the poor, or the most marginalized, again taking the brunt and again taking the onus and the responsibility for something that someone else is benefiting of. So I think it's why, again, it comes back to it being a social issue and not so much an economic issue, or all these other things which we quietly hide behind. So we always try and find ways of escaping the elephant in the room, and that is a question of justice. That is a question of rights, and that's also, I mean, extend that to ecological rights. They extend that to the rights of millipedes, butterflies, soil microbes. Why are we sitting only at the rights of say only communities? So when we look at that, and we look at intrinsic values of even nature, then we have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to develop, and how do we develop? So there is a particular model that we are all trying to follow and ape, and that model is leading us down a very slippery slope. You take any example in the country. So I'm right now in Mysore, and right next to me is Coorg, the district of Coorg, one of India's best coffee growing regions, right? Beautiful place, everyone loves to go there. What's been happening in the district of Coorg? Landslides, excessive rain and landslides. People are, I mean, literally the mountains are falling, the hills are falling. This pristine paradise, as it was, is sliding away. And how is that happening? That's because we're following this model of development where you build and put more infrastructure, and you don't put back into nature, you don't respect the natural world. And so we end up there. And these are the models that have been showcased, and everybody is now getting on that bandwagon, whether it's Africa or Asia or all the so-called less developed nations. are getting on this, and we shouldn't go down that path. But it is a question of pulling people out of poverty. How do you do it? It is a very complex issue, um, and there's no quick fix to it. But the short and simple answer is we have to find alternatives, and there are alternatives. There are ways of putting power back into rural communities, or putting or decentralizing a lot of things. There are answers to these. It's more complex than it is, but we have to get to a stage where we even say that, okay, are we going down the right path? Right now, the problem is everyone's accepted, or not everyone, but most people have accepted that, no, this is the only way to develop, as it were. This is the only way, this is the aspiration, and this is the only way forward. So when we have put that as not questionable, we don't question consumption, we don't question unending growth, then we're stuck, because then you're trying to find systems to work within to find it. And the only way you're going to go there is by exploiting, and is by using up fossil fuels, is by doing that. And when so many billion people start doing that, then they're going to be in a very precarious position. So that is, we really have to rethink and look at it, flip the way of looking at it.
If you would have to explain to a common person what this biodiversity loss would mean, with respect to climate change. So what message would you have to, like, if you had to explain it in a very simple way? So what would be your message?
I think it's the message is quite simple. Is if you are genuinely interested in living well, in having a good life, and having a good way of interacting then you have to interact with the natural world. You have to interact with other human beings. You have to interact from a particular place. So it's almost philosophical in a way. Which is why, again, I bring this argument back to, you have to stop talking about it just in terms of economics or in terms of technical, technological fixes. These are social, spiritual issues in a very, very when it comes down to the crux of it. Because if we don't respect and look at nature, or look at the natural world, there is no way to understand it. As much as you try and extract data from it, which is fine, you can in certain aspects, but it has to go into a combination of actually relating to that. So the problem is we have stopped relating to our environment. We have stopped relating. No one cares as much anymore. No one cares about where their water is coming from, what it means. Bangalore or Mysore, again, the example with the Kaveri River, no one really cares. Who's gone seen it? Who's looking at those grizzled giant squirrels that are there? Who's looking at the Kaveri Wildlife Sanctuary, which they now want to say put a dam on? Or there's all these other things happening. So I think the first step is to stop theorizing so much, and is to actually just step outside. Now that maybe a lockdown is lifted, maybe step outside, go out, look at stuff, breathe the air, and look at trees, birds, get involved with that, and then connect to the theoretical part, then connect to that. Because if we lose our sense of bearing, and I think most people are disconnected from the natural world, from these issues. So then it becomes a theoretical exercise. And a lot of the time I talk to people who are not ecologists, who are not in this field, but everyone has very strong opinions of how we must do what. But people are not comfortable just going outside and looking at a butterfly or a tiger or elephant or whatever. So I think that is actually the first step, is whether it's a lay person or a young person, is to actually go and spend a little time outdoors and take that experience then to actually look at the theory of all this stuff. And when you talk about the theory of all this stuff, what does it boil down to, and what does it in practical terms come down to? It comes down to how we frame policy, right? So in India, for example, we're talking about all these targets we're supposed to be hitting in terms of greenhouse gases and policy level changes. We're not going to be able to do that, because the way in which you're looking at policy, you're not empowering people, rural people or local people, to actually be able to conserve nature, to conserve wildlife. So we have, say, 4 or 5% of our forests right now, which are protected by the government or come under the forest department. And the rest of the lands pretty much are termed as wastelands, or which are basically not wastelands. These are community grazing lands. These are grasslands. So until we are able to, at a policy level, shift our way of looking at land, looking at nature, and not commodifying it, we're going to have an issue. And until we are not able to look at trust that people will take care of their own resources and people will want to be part of this, we're going to have an issue. So at a policy level, we need to be able to allow rural communities, people on the ground, to be able to take care of their nature and wildlife and ecosystem and trees and rivers, which people want to do, because people are not stupid. People have lived, especially communities who have lived alongside these things, and they know. The point is, there's very little option for them.
You have always, lived around nature, and you have worked, incessantly towards conserving it. And you've also spent a lot of time with, local communities and indigenous people who have been, living for centuries in forests and have a very beautiful symbiotic relationship with it, which I think personally is the only right way to live. So, sir, can you talk about, can you throw some light on the communities that you have worked with and what kind of work you did with them, and, just sort of the acknowledgement that they deserve, they should be getting?
Again, so things are complex, right? Generally, especially when you go deeper into any subject, it's complex. So we also have to be careful a little bit of romanticizing indigenous communities or local communities. So I don't want to be on either end where we're villainizing it or romanticizing it. But what's happening in today's narrative is that rural communities, indigenous communities, are not brought on board and are not taken, are being vilified in a way, are being seen as people who don't understand how life works, who don't understand how relationships work, who don't understand how nature works, who don't respect and respond to it. And that's not true. So I think it is the right moment to say that, listen, so for example, if you just take a very simple thing, where is policies being dictated? Is anyone actually asking indigenous leaders, community members, what their opinion is? How do you conserve wildlife and biodiversity? No, there are city folk, there are people like me who are giving advice here, and I'm still a grassroots person. There are people sitting in fancy swanky offices somewhere dictating some policy, and not the person who actually knows how to deal with an elephant or with a river, who actually has a relationship with that. So it's true, we do need to, so the communities who live alongside nature have ways, and without romanticizing it, they're also very exploitative at times, and they can be, and their communities have also taken a beating, and they've, in the way that they've been decimated by our worldview, our culture of looking at the world. It's been corrupted and decimated for centuries. I mean, there are almost no communities who live that closely anymore. But still, if you look at any of the communities, whether it's central India, you look at the Gonds and the Baigas, or you look at the Kanis of the southern Western Ghats, or you look, so all the indigenous people have a very close link with the land, with the forest, with the rivers, with the grasslands, and that way of living truly does have a lot to teach us. Now, whether that is the only way to live or that is the way to survive, I don't think most people will be able to do that to start with or even enjoy that. But what happens is, because people say, oh, that's regressive, that's old, we can't do that, you also throw out any learnings, any knowledge, anything you can learn from communities. And they have survived for thousands, tens of thousands of years alongside their resources, as we term it, and have done a lot of stuff. Yes, there are issues. There are a bunch of arguments, counter arguments to that. But the simple point is, we don't acknowledge that people have managed to live alongside other beings, other creatures. Biligiri Rangana Temple Wildlife Sanctuary, BR Hills in Karnataka, is a great example of where you have Soliga indigenous communities living in a forest area alongside tigers. And tiger numbers keep going up and have gone up, and the forest does well. And the indigenous community is there, they're inside the forest, and they have been a huge part of taking care of it. It's when you alienate them and you say it's not your forest anymore, it's not your resource anymore, that's when they're like, okay, fine, it's not us, it's some government departments, and then there's conflict arises. It's quite simple. As soon as you allow people to take ownership and be part of a process, people take ownership and be part of the process. We have to have that basic trust in, um, of looking at it and find solutions to people. We're not able to provide optimal solutions. So I think a lot of communities, basically communities who live alongside nature and who have a lot to teach us. And I think we need to really look at that. And then of course there are people in other communities who are not necessarily indigenous. There is a lot of wisdom there. There's a lot of mess as well. Okay, it's not that they're just living in harmony and all that. A lot of people want to just burn things down, chop trees down, kill wildlife. All that also happens. But there's the other side to it, and it's also about providing opportunities and finding ways in which they're able to live alongside nature.
As someone being from a background in geography and environmental sciences myself, I've always been really curious of opportunities for youth and employment options for people of just fresh out of our education, in this green economy market.
If you're a young person and you're interested in doing something in terms of nature conservation or sustainability, I think it's very important to go to grassroots level first. And I know it may not be very appealing to a lot of people, but I think there's a lot of value in that. There's value in actually understanding the subjects and of what you're talking about. So I wouldn't personally, I don't recommend. I mean, there is enough and more companies and startups and all these things offering. So for example, there's windmill companies or solar companies, and everyone calls that green and part of the green economy. And I completely disagree with that. I think it's largely hogwash and largely another form of where capitalism is just finding new ways of making profit under the guise of, there are of course certain things which are done with well-intentioned ways, but the larger scale projects are usually just profit oriented. And so the whole green goes out of the window. And what does it really mean to develop and to be green? And so as a young person, if you're interested in these issues, because it's so complex, and because as long as there's profit to be made, there will be people to con you into thinking there are certain ways of doing it and what the narrative is. So I think more than anything else, it's important. So more than saying, okay, this specific place or that specific place, it's important to find grassroots spaces where you can actually go and interact with nature, with communities, and get some sort of foundation and basis to understand what does it mean, what does development mean, how do people live, what is a forest, what is the natural world. So if you are able to think for yourself and develop those skill sets, or even spend a year or two minimum on doing that, then I think you stand a chance of actually trying to understand and get into it. Because otherwise you just get, bashed sideways, pulled into something, and then you don't have a grassroots ground-based understanding. So my recommendation to young people is actually to go out and find people working on the ground with sustainability, with nature, and see all the complexities there. And from there, then look at getting into the larger organizations or getting into the more, commercialized setups. So I really would urge young people and people who are interested in this field to go and get your hands dirty. There is no better way to do it, and you don't learn that in university, and you don't learn that sitting in offices. You only learn that by being out in the field and doing that. And it may not be possible for everyone, but that's the only way I know, or that's the only way I recommend. That's what I would have to say to that.
Since you are based in Karnataka, and I would just want to know what are the aspects of this field to grow in a more sort of urban landscape. For example, in Bangalore, how this can be incorporated in the urban life, and this sort of metropolitan economy, and how should this be approached to get people sort of from city to village or forest, to encourage people, because a lot of the times people are unaware, and they are willing, or they might actually want to work, but they are unaware of it. So what do you think, how this should be approached and made heard?
Yeah, so I mean, it's true. Not everyone can go and sit in a rural area or in a forest area and get these experiences or be part of that. And there are amazing communities, people, institutions working in the cities. People are doing lake restoration. People are working on supporting nesting colonies of birds in particular areas, or particular trees that are being impacted. So there are organizations in Bangalore, for example. You have Environment Support Group, who's an activist organization, but also an organization that works on urban issues. You have ATREE, which is a kind of a research-based organization, but there are also certain parts, the certain people in there work with urban issues. You have different institutions like that, and you have individuals. So I think it's again about doing a little bit of research, seeing what fits with you, what kind of you have to just put in a bit of effort and try and see what's going on in your area, in your city, because there are already people doing stuff. It's almost everywhere. There is somebody or the other being involved who said, okay, you know what, we can do a better job of, instead of just having concrete jungles, let's find ways to do something about this. And so people have taken initiatives, and there are. So in your area, in your city, in your town, reach out and find out who's doing what. So people are either working on doing environment education programs, or they're looking at how do you make your own apartment complexes greener. There's somebody doing something, and so you have to start. So my advice is, whatever time, effort, energy you have, and interest, it's about going and starting. And now we have the internet, so so there's so much information out there. It's not that there isn't information. When there was no internet and you wanted to start as a young person, you literally needed the contacts. You needed to go, you needed to find, you need to get an appointment with someone. Someone had to know someone. Now it's much easier. So I think it's just about starting and finding out and going for it, and spend some time, effort, energy, and do it. And I think it'll be totally fine. It's about interest levels and whether we really are keen on pushing ourselves out of our comfort zone to do something, or to get involved. It boils down to that.
Concluding this session, the takeaway message that you would give to, as a sort of policy measure for, the developmental trajectory for India, because especially now, since we have received the red alert of climate, every nation is, sort of actually rushing towards adopting renewable energy and more sustainable methods of development. So, and I mean, India is very resource rich, and we have the treasure of, natural resources that probably we don't even realize. So what is the key thing that needs to be kept in mind in terms of policy and administrative level decisions while we are on this journey of, sort of achieving more sustainability?
Well, boil down to something I was saying earlier again, and we're headed down a very slippery slope, because right now, what is green and what is sustainable and what is renewable, I think is very contentious and needs to be questioned. So what is being called as renewable or green are things like windmills, solar plants, and these things, which are not. If you actually audit and look at how they are, they're not that green. And the way in which they're implemented at large scales. So for example, solar, if you had rooftop solar, is very different from having thousands of acres of solar parks on wolf habitat and on grasslands where you've just thrown out a bunch of shepherds and completely degraded a grassland over 10,000 acres. It's very different from saying everybody in the city should have, some form of renewable energy there. So it's the way policies are framed. Second is, again, going back to empower communities to take charge of their resources. If you want to achieve any of these targets, if you want to do that, I think that is important. And right now we have left that out. It's all top-down approaches, all policies made somewhere else, which are being pushed down the throats of everybody else. And these are again done with very clear tie-ups with large. So a lot of these are large projects, which means large infrastructure, large amounts of capital. And so it's just a different kind of thing rebranded, as it were. So it's the same kind of companies that might have been doing some other exploitative thing, which now will have the same bids in for renewable work. So are we really being renewable? Is that the way forward? So I think at the policy level, there needs to be some real consultation with people on the ground, not just experts, as it were, actually with communities, with people, and finding that out. And there are people who have given their lives. I mean, I'm just one small person in that. There are people who have spent 40 years, 50 years, people who have really done work, who know their subjects, who need to be consulted and are not getting consulted. They're completely getting left out of anything. There are communities who have lived. Who's asking and who's talking to them? Nobody is. We're making policy based on something else. So it needs a total revamp. Controlling of resources. Right now, it's controlled by the government, by the forest department is controlling, and is supposed to be protecting our nature, right? Our forests. Anything outside of that is not protected. 80% of your wildlife is running around. Is running around in the rest of outside of protected areas. It's not in protected in zones. So what are we talking about? The grasslands are not even considered a category. They're called wastelands. These are policy level changes that have to be made. Communities are not allowed. There's no framework for communities to actually say, hey, listen, we want to protect our lands. We want to find ways to increase biodiversity. You can term it what you want. You can say, increase carbon storage. There is no framework for that. There is no policy level framework for that. So we need to reframe the way in which we empower people to contribute to this, to ensure that. So that's the real policy level change. It needs a complete revamp of the way in which we look at it.
Okay, so thank you, sir. It was an amazing session. It was so lovely talking to you. And like I said, having a background in earth sciences myself, I was especially intrigued, and I got to know some really eye-opening facts, especially about how you said that renewable energy sector can actually hide in the background of capitalization and the same level of exploiting exploitative industry. So it was really enlightening talking to you, and thank you for your time. And I hope everyone who gets to read our newsletter and gets enlightened by your words and gets inspired to do something. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and you're being too kind and a bit too it's not I don't know, and yeah, so it's very kind of you to say all those things. I really do hope that people would think about it a bit more. My point is, maybe it's a bit provocative, but my point is that we need to think. We need to not accept things for granted, and get involved. And once you start getting involved, you see the complexities, you see the beauty of nature, you see a whole bunch of things, and that's the only way there is to go about doing this. So thanks for having me, and hopefully more soon.